Okay, great. And thank you all so much for being here for our third Taos lecture of the year. And of course, we are so grateful to Dr. Marc Dollinger for being here for yet another lecture. I know a lot of us are Dollinger groupies at this point, just hanging on every word because he has so much wisdom to impart. And I'm really excited about today's lecture in particular. So Dr. Marc Dollinger, he holds the Richard and Rhonda Goldman Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies and Social Responsibility at the San Francisco State University. He served as a research fellow at Princeton University's Center for the Study of Religion, as well as the Andrew W. Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow and Lecturer in the Humanities at Bryn Mawr College, where he coordinated the program in Jewish Studies. He's the author of wonderful scholarly books, most recently Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance in the 1960s. He's been published in Encyclopedia Judaica, the Encyclopedia of Anti-Semitism, the Encyclopedia of African American Education, and his next project, A Tale of Two Campuses, Jews and Identity Politics in the Golden State, traces his experience as a Jewish professor at both right-wing and left-wing universities. And we were so blessed to hear about that last year during a lecture that you offered for us. His resume goes on and on with so many truly wonderful accomplishments through podcasts and all different sorts of interactions with, Brandeis Hillel School and JCCs and so on. But I don't want to use too much of the time because I know we want to spend this time really learning from you, Marc. And we're so glad that you're offering this particular lecture, which is entitled 1619, 1654, 2021, Jews, Race, and U.S. History. And we just thank you so much for being here with us once more.
Thank you, Rabbi. And most important part of my introduction, Bar Mitzvah, Temple Beth Ellen Center, December 18th, 1976, which was the 25th of Kislev on the Hebrew calendar. Parshat Vayeshev, for your interest. So now we're going to, can everyone see that? Give me a thumbs up if you can see we're all good with that? Okay, so let's begin. 1 year ago, the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police sparked a national reckoning on race with a level of public interest we have not seen since the 1960s. When we look at the protests that followed, their size, the number of white allies, the cities and towns across the country, and of course, the importance of social media as a tool to organize, we can argue that this was even bigger than the civil rights movement of the 1960s. In fact, we may be bearing witness today to the most significant moment in American racial justice since Reconstruction ended in 1877. Yet today's call for racial equality is different from Reconstruction, and it's different from the 1960s. White Americans' very definition of racism is changing. Back when I was at Temple Bethel growing up in Sunday school, now I can say that here because you were, many of you were with me then. It used to mean supporting Jim Crow or the KKK. Now it means being an anti-racist. It used to mean treating someone differently because of the color of their skin. Now it means enjoying the benefits from a social system that privileges whites at the expense of people of color. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into an often uncomfortable topic. This is the history of American Jews, race, and racism. I'm going to try to bridge the gap between the rhetoric you might be reading about or watching on TV with our own understandings of the American Jewish past. So I'm going to assume that all of you already heard and know and maybe even lived the story of American Jewish success, of social mobility, of achieving the American dream. And here's the good news, it's all true. America has offered us an extraordinary, even exceptional experience. We as American Jews worked hard. We pressed our children to get an education, sacrificed for a better future. achieved great success in business, in law, in medicine, right? You name the professional field. Jews did pull themselves up by their bootstraps to achieve the American dream. And Jews also achieved success, especially in the years after World War II, because of our privileged racial status. And even before World War II, racism created a system of white supremacy where those considered white enjoyed like VIP status. Whites enjoyed better and easier access to education, to healthcare, judicial system, housing. In such a powerful and painful irony, Jews who suffer themselves from anti-Semitism also benefit from white supremacy. Today, I'm arguing that both are possible at the same time. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at 3 different expressions of racism in American Jewish history. First, we're going to look at times when American Jews actually embraced racist thoughts. Good news, these were fortunately the fewest. But we're also going to look at times when American Jews were complicit in racism. These are moments when Jews remained silent to the racism around them. And it happened more often in history than we'd like, and it still challenges us today. But most of all, today we're going to look at times when American Jews benefit from racism, whether they were trying to or not. And this is key because, as it turns out, all we have to do is exist. And with that existence, we're part of a system of racial separation when it comes to how our society's resources are allocated. I'm not sure if I did my Jews and whiteness talk for you all in earlier years, but we're not going to debate whether or not Jews are white. I'm just going to say if you're presenting like me today, you're going to be white, and we're going to talk about white Jews because Jews of color have an experience that's very different in American Jewish history. It isn't the focus of today's talk, but it's something that we certainly need to know and learn about. So I encourage all of you to read up. There's really good articles and op-eds and videos and things on the internet written by Jews of color. If you want recommendations, feel free to send me an email and I'll give you some of my favorites. For today, though, my focus is going to be white European American Jews and how they experienced history. So it's great to be back at Temple Beth El, even if by Zoom. But now, hopefully, as we are getting the better hand with vaccinations, next time we can be in person. Here is the historical question for today. How and why have white American Jews supported, complied, and benefit from systemic racism? I'm going to argue that the process of becoming American over time and place encouraged Jews to embrace the political and social culture around them. Regardless of time or place, that meant Jews benefit from a system of white supremacy that rewarded them with privilege not extended to people of color. While it is an important and heartwarming story, Jews' disproportionate participation in social justice causes did not negate the influence of their whiteness in their impressive rise. Systemic racism doesn't demand agreement. It simply exists. So my career thesis argues that Jews tend to follow the political culture of the society around them, no matter the time or the place. And what I'm going to do is just take that thesis, I'm going to apply it to the questions of race, and I'm going to use becoming American as the theme. And that's to say, Jews have worked very hard to become American. You probably know in your own family stories, our ancestors learned English. Many changed their religious practice. Many changed our names. But another thing that we did that we don't actually talk about so much is racism. So here's how today goes. Ari Katz, who runs Orange County's Jewish Education Program, reached out to me just after Floyd's murder to say, we need to talk on the history of Jews and racism. Since my community knows you, you're the one to give it. Would you do it? And I said, yeah, I think it's time to write that lecture. He said, great, you have 4 days because you're scheduled for Wednesday. So quickly, what I decided to do is take this book that Rabbi Gary Zola and I edited. It's a collection of historical documents in American Jewish history. Rabbi Zola teaches at the Hebrew Union College, the seminary in Cincinnati. I don't know, Rabbi, if you were in Cincinnati or New York for the last few years. So what I did is I just opened the book to chapter 1. And I looked for any historical document related to race, and then I photocopied it. I made a PowerPoint. I highlighted the sections for us to talk about. We're just going to walk through the book. And that's important because this book's been out about 4 or 5 years now, and it's kind of the standard, document reader for American Jewish history classes at universities across the country. So none of this is new. And undergraduates have been reading these documents already. I guess what's new is I'm only pulling out the documents related to race, and I put this thesis about becoming American to try to tie them together. So let's start with our first document. This is a picture of a schematic of Recife, Brazil. Recife, Brazil is important because in 1650s, this is where the first group of Jews that would permanently settle in colonial North America came from. 1654, they landed in what was then New Amsterdam. It soon became New York. What did it mean to become American for these first 17th century Jews? How would they act in their new surroundings? And for us today, when and where would racism intersect with Judaism? To give you some background, not too many Jews in colonial America. Even as late as 1776, the first day of the new country, scholars think somewhere between 2,500 and 5,000 Jews, in all of North America. Almost all of them were Sephardic. And certainly they were in like Boston and New York and Philadelphia, where we would expect. They were also in Charleston, Newport, and Savannah. And this was key because these Sephardic Jews made a living with transatlantic trade. And they were successful in transatlantic trade because the Christians around them trusted them because, frankly, they had fellow Jews and often family members across oceans who were handling the other side of the transaction. So you knew you could trust a Jewish merchant because if anyone tried to rip you off, they would be banished, right? Because their family and certainly their Jewish people would be upset if they're giving a bad name. So in 1713, we had a situation develop where the colonial governor of New York ordered an embargo of all exports to the island of Jamaica in the Caribbean. So the question is, if you're a Jewish merchant out of New York and you've got a ship full of goods to go to Jamaica, and now there's an embargo on Jamaica, what do you do? So here we have a letter from the Jewish merchant and his partner to Governor Hunter. And I didn't highlight any of it because it's basically an appeal to the governor to say, look, give me an exception to the embargo. I've got to stay in business. I got a ship ready to go. Would you please just write me a special letter that lets me deliver my goods? And I put this one up as a bit of a trick because this is an easier one. The harder question would be, what if the cargo wasn't dry goods going to Jamaica? What if they were Africans coming back to North America in slavery? What's the Jewish thing to do? What's the American thing to do? What's the right thing to do? All right, hypothetically, what would we do, right? Well, I'd like to think that we'd all be anti-slavery, right? And we would refuse to do this, but slavery was the law of the land. The colonial economy was built on slavery. If you remember like 8th grade or 11th grade, if you studied in California, we learned about the triangle trade route with slavery. You needed to have it for business to work. The entire shipping industry relied on the transport of Africans into slavery to make it work. So guess what? Colonial Jews did their job. And here from 1762, we have a letter from 2 Jewish merchants to the captain of their ship. And here is a piece of that letter. They order the captain that you embrace the first fair wind and proceed to sea and make the best of your way to the windward part of the coast of Africa. And at your arrival there, dispose of your cargo for the most possible can be gotten and invest the neat proceeds into as many good, merchantable, young slaves as you can, and make all the dispatch you possibly can. All right, we have to start here actually with Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam, because this is an anti-Semite and an anti-Semitic organization. And they have been making the claim for years that Jews controlled the slave trade, that Jews dominated the slave trade, that Jews were disproportionately involved in the slave trade. This is not true. Thankfully, Professor Eli Faber actually wrote an entire book to discount the Nation of Islam and Farrakhan's claims. And that said, it turns out that there were slave owners who were Jews. Because if you were Jewish and you were living in this period and slavery was everywhere, you were going to be a part of it. And here's the tricky part of this particular document. If you look here in the lower right-hand corner, it's from the Massachusetts Historical Society and the Commerce of Rhode Island, because this ship was coming from Rhode Island. It was not actually a Southern ship. What if, or what did it mean if becoming American happened in the colonial South? What if you earned a comfortable living? What if you were white and male? What if you had the possibility to own slaves? Would you do it? And of course, you can tell already by showing up today, the answer is going to be yes. I think a deeper question is, how are you going to self-reflect on that slave ownership? How on earth are you going to reconcile it with your Judaism? If you have to choose between enjoying your status as a white Southerner who could own slaves, and what I'd like to think is our obligation as Jews who'd be opposed to slavery, what are you going to do? So just as a warning, I want you to know that the next document is going to have the N word several times. I, of course, not going to say it, but you will see it in front of you. Here is a letter from 1762 from Mayor Josephson, a Jewish Southern man, to Michael Gratz, who in fact is his cousin. And here's a piece of the letter. If you come here for the coming Sabbath Nachmu, it would please me very much, because we're presently very lonesome on the Sabbath. I also inform you that I may again sell my N-word wench at a profit. So if a ship with N-words should arrive, or a ship with indentured Germans, you will let me know, because I cannot manage without a servant. The wench I now have has two virtues, both bad ones. First, she's drunk all day when she can get it. And second, she's mean so that my wife cannot say a word to her. She is afraid of her. How did all this happen? A free N-word here wants to court her and to buy her from me. I don't want to give her away for less than 110 pounds with her bastard, because I bought the bastard too. Signed, your affectionate friend, the humble Meir, son of Yosef from Yever, scholar of blessed memory. Okay, wow. All right, first of all, this is just an ordinary letter between two cousins from 1762. They have no idea that centuries later it's going to be on a Zoom talk for the top lecture series for Temple Bethel, and because they had no expectation that this would go public centuries later, it's honest. And it opens with the Parsha, with the fact that he's lonely as a Southern Jewish man, and he just loved his cousin to come and hang out with him on Shabbos. So it opens with the Jewish. It closes, your affectionate friend, the humble Meir, son of Joseph, scholar of blessed memory. That's all Jewish, right? And in the middle of it is just outright blatant racism, which means becoming American for these people at this time in this place had all of these fully integrated. Let's look at the early national period. This is the first years of the new republic after 1776. The Declaration of Independence promised life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to everyone. The Constitution, about a dozen years later, promised to realize those ideals into a set of laws. But as I think we're pretty much aware, most of it only applied if you were white, literate, landed, and male. Well, it turns out there were Jewish men in the early republic who fit each of those categories. And the moment that happened, becoming American created complicity, at least complicity in a racist system. So let's look at the last will and testament of Samuel Jones from 1809. And in this will, he writes, "After my funeral expenses and my lawful debts are paid, if I should not emancipate my Negro woman Jenny and her son Emmanuel during my lifetime, it is my desire that my executors do emancipate my Negro woman Jenny and her son Emmanuel, and to give to Jenny my bed sheets, bedstead, blankets, tables, pots, plates, chairs, looking glass. To my Negro woman, Jenny, $200. To Jenny, I also leave the income of the leases of $100 per year to be paid quarterly. And it is my further desire not to drive Jenny and her children out of my house on King Street until they have time to procure a place for their own abode." All right, how do we analyze this document? First, if you read the whole thing, you'd see that Jenny is getting more money than any other person. Jenny's getting more money than any other organization. Jenny's child, Emmanuel, is getting money. What I found fascinating was that Jenny's getting his bed sheets. Why would he give her his bed sheets? Well, because scholars have figured out that Samuel Jones is Emmanuel's father. Jenny cannot consent to sexual relations. This was rape. Today, we know it's wrong for men in the workplace to have sexual relationships with subordinates. If there's a power differential, there's a problem. This was slavery. Jenny wasn't a citizen. She wasn't a person according to the law. This was not romantic love. If this was love, then Samuel would have freed her, and he didn't. If this was love, Samuel would have moved with the family to the north. Maybe they could homestead in the Midwest, go to the Caribbean, go to Europe, like find any place where an interracial family could live in peace. But he didn't. While we think being Jewish makes us different, I argue that in America, we tend to be more the same than we like to think. Becoming American encourages us to copy those around us. Now I'm going to ask a really difficult, challenging question. What's wrong with raping an African-American woman you own in slavery? There's only one way you can even ask such a question, and that's the answer is Thomas Jefferson. Fathered multiple children with Sally Hemings, and she could not consent. And he was the one who wrote the Declaration of Independence. George Washington owned slaves. With our founding fathers, our nation's quintessential Americans owning slaves, fathering children with them, who could possibly expect American Jews to call them out or act differently? Civil War. All right, we'll start with the premise. Slavery is wrong, and slavery is un-Jewish. Judaism, especially these days, says tikkun olam, repair the world. Our rabbis take very strong social justice positions, sometimes with dissent from members of their own congregation, and you know where this is going. This is Rabbi Morris Rafal. In 1861, he gave a sermon called The Bible View of Slavery, a defense of slavery, and here's a part of it. From Genesis 9:29, Noah. You and I may regret that in his anger, Noah should, from beneath the waters of wrath, again have fished up the idea and practice of slavery. But that he did so is a fact which rests on the authority of Scripture. I arrive at the conclusion that next to the domestic relations between husband and wife, parents and children, the oldest relation of society with which we are acquainted is that of master and slave. When you remember that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Job, the men with whom the Almighty conversed, all these men were slaveholders, does it not strike you that you are guilty of something very little short of blasphemy? My friends, I'm sorry to find that I'm delivering a pro-slavery discourse. I'm no friend to slavery in the abstract, still less friendly to the practical working of slavery. But I stand here as a teacher in Israel, not to place before you my own feelings and opinions, but to propound to you the word of God, the Bible view of slavery. The results to which the Bible view of slavery leads us is first, that slavery has existed since the earliest time. Second, that slavery is no sin, and that slave property is expressly placed under the protection of the Ten Commandments. All right, now, what's fascinating about this document, you see this brown line up here at the top? I put that there to get rid of the name of the synagogue where Rabbi Rafal was from, because it was B'nai Jeshurun in New York City. If you're not familiar with B'nai Jeshurun, it is like the hip congregation of North America. Now, Bethel is hip, all right. And anytime synagogues are like doing strategic planning processes, pre and post COVID, they're going to send like 3 to 5 of their congregants on a plane to New York and say, go to B'nai Jeshurun, watch what they're doing, see how it is, and then come back and tell us, right? So how about this? In 1861, on the eve of the Civil War, it's a northern rabbi at a congregation which is going to be one of the nation's most progressive that is giving the Bible view of slavery. Just for fun, this is academic fun, it's not actual fun. I gave this talk about 3 weeks ago to the Manhattan JCC, but I didn't realize it was co-sponsored by B'nai Jeshurun, and I was introduced by the rabbi from B'nai Jeshurun. And then I got to this document and went, oh my goodness, and I looked at her face as we're doing it. And even before I revealed the name, she was letting me know that she absolutely knows this document, that everybody who's a rabbi at B'nai Jeshurun knows and sees it. All right, let's go to 1867, Rabbi Isaac Meir Wise, probably the most important rabbi of the mid-19th century, founder of the Jewish seminary in Cincinnati, had his own newspaper called The Israelite, and he decides that he's going to go take a tour of Richmond, Virginia, and he took a diary along, and he sort of gave his thoughts and reflections on the Civil War, on Reconstruction, and on the future of America. And then he got back to Cincinnati, and he translated his diary into this article. So here's a piece of it. As inevitable as fate, the 11 southern states are to belong to the Negroes. The enfranchisement of the Negro and the disenfranchisement of so many white men places the destiny of those states entirely in the hands of the Negro. The next consequence will be that as many white men as will possibly be able to sell out will go to the North. This again is as inevitable as fate, for the Southern man will not submit to Negro rule 1 minute longer than he must. The longevity and prolification of the Negro in that climate gives him a natural advantage over the white race and must in time press it from these states. The next consequence of the emigration of the white will be a new immigration of Negroes from Africa. 11 Negro legislatures, the representatives of 11 states in Congress, the thinly populated country, the want of labor, the better climate than the African, the good government, the rich country. Take all these circumstances together, and you cannot deny that the southern states in the course of 25 years will be a new Africa. The South will never be what it was. Her cotton trade is ruined. The white people will leave as fast as they can. That is the end of it. All right, becoming American extends even to our highest standing clergy. For Rabbi Wise, freedom for former slaves conflicted with his view of what America should be. Let's go to the Industrial Revolution, the late 19th, early 20th century. Even though Reconstruction ended in 1877, systemic racism continued. It just did it in different forms. Sharecropping replaced slavery. Lynchings maintained the terror of slave times. Poverty crimes invalidated the 13th Amendment and became what is now mass incarceration. While we typically think of this as Southern and not Northern, as non-Jewish rather than Jewish, the institutionalization of racism knew no such boundaries. This is a Triangle Shirtwaist factory in New York City. You're probably best or worst familiar with it as the site of that horrific 1911 fire that killed 146 people, mostly Jewish women laborers. We typically learn about Triangle Shirtwaist as a labor story. Unsafe working conditions led to the fire. Lack of exits led to the deaths. It was built on a capitalist system that preyed on new immigrants who needed the work. Jews were the ones who led the union movement that helped. All good, right? Well, not so much. We know it was a class problem because it was about rich factory owners and poor immigrant workers. We know it was a gender problem because Jewish women faced the worst of these working conditions. And it was a systemic racism problem too. You see, they used cotton to sew in all those New York City factories. The cotton came from the South. The white landowners who sold the cotton got it by exploiting Black sharecropping farmers. The Northern economy could not operate without its reliance on a racist Southern economy. And there's another complication. There were 241 textile factories in New York City in the late 19th century. Almost every one of them, 234 of the 241, were owned by Central European Jews, what we used to call German Jews. So management in the labor management split was also Jewish. This was a Jew versus Jew situation. This is what becoming American meant in turn of the century New York. It's not what we remember, or at least, what some of us were taught growing up in religious school. This is where historical memory does not match history. We have erased the intra-Jewish part of the story. We've erased the sharecropping economic racism part of the story. And instead, we've told a story about Jews leading the labor union movement. Let's move to the 1930s, the New Deal, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, of course. This was a good time for Jews. Ironically, the Great Depression was a good time. One of the reasons that FDR brought Jews into the federal government more than any other president before him. He embraced Jewish ideas about poverty. In fact, one of my favorites in his administration was Isaac Rubinow, a Russian Jewish immigrant, Cornell University economist. He was one of the authors of the Social Security Act of 1935. And he was so smart that as early as 1930, even before the Great Depression started in any meaningful way, he went to the annual meeting of the Jewish Social Workers Convention. And here he asked the question, what do we owe Peter Stuyvesant? This is a reference to those very first Jews from 1654 who made a promise to Dutch colonial governor Stuyvesant that if he gave them permission to stay, they would promise never to go on welfare, and that the Jewish people would take care of the welfare needs of their fellow Jews. But by 1930, Rubinow understood with the modern industrial economy that Jews could not be responsible for taking care of their own needs. As he wrote here, and as he said to them, Jewish poverty is not a result of intergroup conditions. It's part and parcel of the whole economic and social problem of wealth production and accumulation of the country as a whole. So if you have an expectation that the problem of Jewish poverty can be met individually, that you can eliminate it irrespective of general economic forces, well, he said this is an expression of excessive group pride and that it's uncontrolled by scientific research and thinking. You see, what he was doing was trying to encourage the federal government to start spending money on the welfare needs of ordinary Americans. And he wanted to tell American Jews that they should take the money. Well, he was pretty successful. Let's take a look at this. In 1929, and these were mostly Jewish federations across the country, gave out just under $2 million in relief, in economic aid to poor and hungry Jewish families. That's going to be our 100%. By 1933, when the Great Depression is worsening, Jewish agencies are now more than doubling the amount of money that they need to spend just like on basic food. Thanks to the New Deal, thanks to what FDR did by taking responsibility for American Jews who no longer have to rely on Jewish organizations. You can see in 1934, and since Dad's here, his birth year, 1935, we're finding that Jewish organizations now are spending less than they had to before. And by the way, now that they don't have to pay for like food. They're able to put money into Jewish education, into religion, into Jewish culture. So this is really, really good for the Jews. Sound great? Well, this was great, unless you were Black. You see, in order to make the New Deal work, to get support in the southern states, FDR made a decision that he was going to allow local politicians to decide how to spend the money coming from the federal government. On the one hand, if you're a local official and Washington sends you a check and tells you what you can and cannot do with the money, you're probably going to be pretty upset because you don't like strings attached. But what if Washington sent you a check and said, spend it as you wish? You're going to love Washington, D.C. And in fact, FDR used this as a way to basically strengthen the Democratic Party around the country, because everybody knew that if you elect a Democrat, then FDR is going to send you a check and you can spend it as you want. You may be aware Eleanor Roosevelt was much better on race issues than her husband was. So guess what happens when the money goes to the South? The whites are in power. The whites get the check. The whites do not share the money equitably with Southern Blacks. I want you to know American Jews did nothing to get a disproportionate share of New Deal funds. All they did is just existed as themselves. Yet, when you have a systemic system of white supremacy and racism that's going to allocate New Deal dollars on racial status, then white Americans are going to get more than their fair share, and Black Americans are going to get less than their fair share without having to do a thing. All right, let's go to post-World War II. A great time for American Jews. Anti-Semitism plummeted between 1945 and 1960. Those anti-Semitic housing covenants that kept Jews out of more favorable neighborhoods came to an end. 500,000 GIs left World War II with the GI Bill that gave them new opportunities for home loans, for small business, for college educations. If any moment in American history was a time that Jews became American, this was it. And perhaps a great example was Levittown. Now Levittowns, because we had several, but the first one was in Pennsylvania. And this was a Jewish real estate developer named William Levitt. And he built tract homes on huge pieces of real estate outside urban areas. And because he could buy the land cheap and basically have cookie cutter houses with the same architecture, he was able to get more room, bigger house for less money. And here's a piece of the oral history of one of the early Jewish residents of Levittown, PA. It was the talk of the Jewish community in Philadelphia, because who would think of buying a house with $1,000 down or $500 down? Levittown became a heavily Jewish-seeking area because immediately Levitt gave a beautiful piece of property to the conservative synagogue. Eventually, they gave ground to the Reform congregation too. I never experienced any discrimination in Levittown because I'm a proud Jew. But as a matter of fact, my mission is to educate not only the Jews, but the Christians. Most of my friends who are Christian, I teach them Bible. So I don't hide the fact that I'm Jewish. No discrimination in Levittown? All right, you probably figured this out. Levittown was racially exclusive. So when he says there's no discrimination, he means that there's no anti-Semitism, right? That's what he's saying. But there's racism, which means that when the anti-Semitic housing covenants left, the racist ones remained. So the early Jewish settlers into Levittown signed covenants that they would never resell their home to Blacks. In 1948, the Supreme Court ruled those unconstitutional. Yet, there were other ways informally that white suburban neighborhoods could remain all white or almost all white. Here's a case when achieving the American dream became complicity in racist housing. Here is a moment where Jews jumped over Blacks and Latinx in their exodus from cities to the suburbs. Who would have thought that supporting home ownership meant supporting racism? Well, I argue, and in the Black Power book that I think I talked about 2 years ago, Jewish civil rights leaders understood this. And in fact, I think this example is probably a better one to understand the complexity of the civil rights movement, because at the very time, white Jews and blacks are joining and marching together. White Jews are joining and benefiting from a system of white supremacy, which is not lost upon those in communities of color who see this as a compromising position. It's hard to have a favorite slide, and I'm glad I'm talking to Temple Beth-El, because this is bringing me back to Temple Beth-El, because UAHC, now the URJ, our national organization, in 1954 did a film strip. I am old enough to remember at Temple Beth-El we had film strips, in school. This was the 300th anniversary of American Jewish settlement in North America, 1654 to 1954. And here's one of the slides. So if you look at America and you look at Americans here, it starts with the Pilgrims. I think this is probably like your Thomas Jefferson, George Washington kind of figure here, your revolutionary. This is like maybe your Davy Crockett and the West. This to me looks like, Abraham Lincoln, like got the top hat going on. And somewhere back here are the Jews. So forget about 1654 for those first Jews from Recife, or the 1840s when the Central European Jews came, or the turn of the 20th century when the Eastern Europeans came. This image from UAHC, now URJ, puts American Jews in line of Americans all the way back to the Pilgrims. When this was shown in 1954, Jews are definitely white. They are definitely a part of this because African Americans cannot produce such a film strip. They cannot see themselves as inheritors of this 300-year history with these particular individuals, because their history is one of slavery and racial oppression. Or to be more pointed, Black Jews cannot relate to UAHC's particular slide, because this is a white-centered view. This is not in the book. I added this a couple months after I started giving the lecture, because I went to reread Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. I found it so compelling to the theme of this lecture. This is one of the original pages of it. And to give background for those that may not be familiar, in Birmingham, the clergy of Birmingham, including Rabbi Milton Grafman, published a full-page ad in the local paper when King was coming down to do a rally, where they basically said, Dr. King, we're in support of civil rights and the rest of it, but we think that you're being a little too ambitious, a little too aggressive, a little too confrontational, and we'd kind of appreciate it if you'd cool off a bit and slow down, because you know what, change takes time, especially in the South. Well, King read this full-page newspaper ad. He didn't like it because it was from clergy. He didn't like it because they put it in the newspaper. Literally, as he's arrested and put into the Birmingham jail, he asks his aide for a pad of paper and a pen. And this is literally that pad of paper. And he just starts writing. And here is a piece of the letter from a Birmingham jail. I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. When I was suddenly catapulted into the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery, Alabama a few years ago, I felt we'd be supported by the white church. I felt that the white ministers, priests, and rabbis of the South would be among our strongest allies. Instead, some have been outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. Dr. King asked us, how much have we as Jewish social justice advocates followed the pattern that he's describing? It's difficult to hear, but Dr. King is arguing that good-hearted liberalism oftentimes translates into complicity in racism. So now let's look at contemporary America. In the 60 years since the civil rights movement ended, we've seen how systemic racism operates in our own lives. And it operates without us having to do a single thing. And if you came to some of the earlier talks, you learned that in the North, we have whites-only neighborhoods, even though we never had Jim Crow laws in the North. We have segregated schools since school enrollments follow racial composition of the neighborhoods. Even as none of these Northern segregated schools are considered a challenge to Brown, which we only apply to the segregation in the South. When public school districts in the North did integrate, sometimes like LA with mandated busing, Jewish parents pulled their children from those schools. With the ability to pay, some sent them to local private schools. Other times they created Jewish community day schools, where some parents wanted, as much Jewish as they could get. That's why you go to a Jewish day school, but other parents wanted as little Jewish as necessary to keep them out of LA Unified, or whatever the public school district was. This clash between white Jewish liberals and a new generation of Black civil rights activists ended the alliance in the mid-60s. Now, American Jews were working for Soviet Jews instead of Southern Blacks. Especially after the Six-Day War and after the anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and at times anti-Semitic stuff from Black Power, Jews turned away from American social justice and towards their own Jewish nationalism. Today, so many of these historical perspectives center on Black Lives Matter. On the most simple level, it's pretty basic. Black lives do, in fact, matter. White Jews then should embrace Black Lives Matter as the next step in our historic commitment to civil rights. Yet, there's a great deal of concern by many white Jews. They hear anti-Israel and anti-Zionist statements at some leftist rallies where they're also backing the Palestinian cause. Occasionally, we found these critiques move into anti-Semitism. Most remember a 200-word statement placed in the nearly 40,000-word platform from the Movement for Black Lives organization. So I argue this is a moment for pause and reflection. It's a time for us to consider the new insights we've learned today and then apply them to current events. We err when we apply our racial understandings from the 50s and 60s to today. This is where our new understanding of racism as systemic, of white supremacy as existing without us even trying, of anti-racism as the new goal, all of this now comes into play. In the most simplistic terms, what's the point? This is about Black lives and the way that systemic racism denies Black Americans equity across the social and economic landscape. Those moments of the 50s and 60s were important and they were productive. But what's happening today is even more important and even more difficult. We aren't just ending Jim Crow laws and passing civil rights laws. We're getting at the heart and soul of American racism, and we're fighting its informality, its deep entrenchment in America. White Jewish social justice activists tell me, first we need to sit side by side to show that Black lives matter. Only then can we create the relationships necessary to have the conversations we need to have about Israel and Zionism. And when that happens, we're going to learn that Black communities are actually as diverse as Jewish communities, that opinions about Israel and Zionism are as varied as they are among white Jews. And we'll all be faced with our own challenges then as members of the Black community share their concerns about things white Jews have said and done that I hope all of us will find awful and embarrassing. And when all that happens, then we can sit together and move forward. A good place for us to start, Jews of color. As so many of our organizations are already aware and hard at work, it turns out that systemic racism, the supremacy of white people, plays out in our own Jewish communal life. Only now are we learning to see things from a new perspective. Only now are we realizing that Jews of color have been experiencing this for years and years. Our best estimate now is that 12 to 15% of American Jews identify as Jews of color. Literally hours ago, the Pew report came out with some new numbers I haven't seen yet. Yet even with numbers this large, few enter organized Jewish spaces, synagogues, JCCs. So I've given some of the reasons why, as I've been learning and growing in my own ways in the past few years on this topic. First, what I call the Jewish test. We ask Jews of color to tell us how they could be Jewish when we don't ask that question of white Jews when they come into our synagogues. For us, it could be simple curiosity. For Jews of color, it's a race-based test. It also exoticizes Jews of color. We're only asking to hear their story because we're finding them exotic. And that's not a real way to bring equity to people. The token. In this scenario, we give special attention to Jews of color because we want people to know how warm and inclusive we are. We put the single Jew of color in our congregation on all of our publicity so that everybody can see. We invite them onto a committee or even onto a board to show that we're inclusive. While seemingly well-intentioned, these acts are now calling out Jews of color for being different, for not being white. And certainly if we want to bring Jews of color into positions of power, we have to make sure that they're not being tokenized and disempowered so that it all looks good, optically, but really nobody's going to change anything. The help. Can I have a second helping of Shabbat dinner, please? Here's my trash. Would you throw it away, please? Oh my goodness. The number of Jews of color who communicate how they're mistaken for the custodial crew when they go into congregational and JCC settings and given instructions that they are supposed to be in service to the white Jews around them. The name tag. This actually happened at the last URJ biennial. A Jew of color came to get her own name tag. Her name was very Jewish sounding. In fact, her name tag had a banner on it that said keynote speaker. This was a very important attendee at the URJ conference, except she couldn't get her name tag because the person at the desk told her that the actual person had to get her own name tag. I am the actual person, she said. And when this broke on social media, so many more stories came of Jews of color who were always imagined to be white until they presented themselves and had to deal with the implications. The guard. Especially after recent violence in synagogues, we've increased security, sometimes even armed guards. Yet we know that people of color face increased risk around police. Maybe even more risk if it's a private security officer who may not be as well trained on these issues. On the most obvious level, how can our Jewish spaces be more welcoming if Jews of color have to navigate their fear of police violence every time they want to pray? On a more subtle level, what assumptions do we have as white Jews to institute security protocols without thinking about these unintended consequences? And it's not just Jews of color who suffer. All of us lose if we don't get to live in our diverse Jewish community as it already exists today. And I'll come back here so I can have a little bit more eye contact because I want to end on a hopeful note, which is that this moment offers us an opportunity for a new approach to racial justice. By seeing what has been invisible to us in American Jewish history, we can begin to see what's been vivid for Black Americans and other communities of color. By letting go of our closely guarded version of American Jewish history, we can begin to see another side of our social mobility, the unintended negative consequences of our success. That knowledge, that consciousness is where we need to be to start the process of dismantling a system that gives social and economic supremacy to white Jews over communities of color. In the best possible way, we can prove Dr. King's upset about Jewish moderates in his letter to a Birmingham jail. We can prove that wrong while we prove his vision of a diverse America right. So I thank you for your time, for your openness, for your listening. I'm happy to hand it back to the rabbi for thoughts, comments, questions, however you'd like to proceed.
Thank you so much for that phenomenal lecture, which gave us so much to think about and such a really rich history. I just want to open it up. If there are people here, if any of you have a question, I invite you to unmute and to ask it. Yeah, Malin.
The other Dr. Dollinger. Dad, you're unmuted, but I cannot hear you. There must be a setting on your computer. Can you type it in the chat?
We don't hear you, unfortunately.
Yeah, I see the page. If you type it in the chat, I think there's a sound setting on the computer that's off. Actually, Dad, I have another idea. Let me go to another question. I'm now turning on my phone, which I always turn off when I do these. So Dad, why don't you just call me and we'll do it that way because we can get your voice through the phone. It's just going to take a second for this to warm up. Any other thoughts or questions? Zelda, perhaps? Let's see, you've unmuted.
Well, it would seem to me that we accept people face value in our communities. And until the habit is changed, which is gradual, I don't know how we can all of a sudden accept people who look a certain way to be accepted in a different fashion. And I think the Jews probably would be more susceptible and more sensitive to that. But I believe we need to give more time. Is that a bad thing to say?
Oh no, well, nothing's bad at this point. Like we're dealing with sort of understanding whole new ways of thinking, and it is going to take time for that to happen. And one of my points today, which has been, I think, a gift of my academic research, it turns out that this stuff has actually been around for a long time. Like when I read the letter from a Birmingham jail, I was like, oh my gosh, like I had no clue that he's going after moderate Jewish liberals, not being strong enough. And I said, how could I have read that whenever I did, like as an undergraduate, and not had it resonate, Zelda, to the point you're making, which is that we have ways we've been doing things for years and years, and now we need to think about new ways to do them.
Right.
And moderation is one, and liberalism is one way that Jews have done it, and now we're sort of being challenged on that.
Yeah.
So that's excellent. And my dad was just calling, so Dad, I'm going to call you back now to get the question. So here we go. One ringy dingy, as we used to learn on Saturday Night Live. Okay, Dad. Well, I'm gonna relay your question. Go ahead. All right, so he's telling me that I talked about the murder of George Floyd, and the New England Journal of Medicine had an article by 3 Black physicians.
Sorry, can't hear him. I can see him talking.
Right, yeah. Okay, great. I'm going to hang up and I'll answer it. So what Dad's pointing out is this movement, which is being called defund the police. And there's a lot of opposition to the notion of defunding the police. And what these Black psychiatrists are arguing is that, in fact, And it's great, my sister Cynthia is here because she's actually trained as a social worker. She has her master's degree from Case Western University in it. And here's the deal, if you have a mental health issue that's happening in the community, are you gonna send someone with a gun? Or are you gonna send someone like my sister who's actually trained to understand how to handle them? The truth is almost all police calls are nonviolent with no real threat of violence. Clearly, if you're gonna have a violent situation, you need somebody with levels of force necessary to keep people safe. But if it's true that the overwhelming majority of situations don't require lethal force and do require someone who actually knows how to talk to somebody who's having mental health issues, then let's take some of the money from policing and move it to hire people like Cynthia, who are then going to go out and actually help people. And that also helps to de-escalate the situation. So there's a debate now about whether the motto defund the police is the right one, because that's kind of a radical revolutionary thing, which is talking about the history of police violence, against a reframe, which is let's have specialists trained in each situation to be able to handle it in that best way. Yeah, thanks, Dad. Zelda.
But we're also requesting that the police department have social workers available on an emergency basis, on a instant call. And that's almost impossible economically. They can be available, but certainly not there when the law enforcement person meets up with a possible problematic person.
Yeah, so thank you. So this is what my dad was pointing out from this article, and this is what they're figuring out now, which is how do you staff, whether it's police departments or alongside police departments, how do you assess the call to determine who the best and safest people are to go out to handle the situation. There are clearly going to be situations where you're going to need an armed police officer, and there's other situations when you don't. So like literally that's today, like I'm not an expert in this, like, but there are people who write books on this, and they are all together trying to figure it out.
And can I just say something?
Oh, of course.
I didn't hear all of what Zelda said because my audio is terrible. But in general, just to let you know that social workers are 24-hour. I mean, like, so many social work positions are 24-hour. I mean, we can call social workers if people are suicidal, homicidal, well, more suicidal. Anyway, to have them hospitalized. I mean, that's an easy thing to do, is to hire a group of social workers that could go out on a call at 3 o'clock in the morning or whenever. That's very possible.
Thomas.
Some of the, it brings back to mind, I was watching some footage of Heschel and the rabbi from Berlin, Prince, who spoke before Martin Luther King. He said, we cannot be a nation of onlookers. We cannot remain silent. That's even more of a danger than the perpetrators. But I think similar.
Yeah, and Thomas is actually bringing up, Rabbi Prinz gave the speech just before Dr. King gave the I Have a Dream speech. So A, it's pretty famous if you're the one right before Dr. King, but B, if you're the one right before Dr. King, people aren't remembering you after Dr. King gave that speech. And Rabbi Prinz, who came from wartime Germany, said that apathy was actually the greatest threat. And he called on American Jews and all Americans to engage. And he was really carrying that from the example of his youth. Thank you, Thomas.
Mark, this is Sunny Feldberg.
Good to see you.
What can I say? But anyway, I just wanted to mention that as a child, I went to Temple B'nai Abraham, and Rabbi Prince was the rabbi there in Newark.
Fantastic. That's a great thing to get to be raised by Rabbi Prinz.
Yes.
Thomas again?
Just a couple things. First of all, I thought the whole thing was fascinating, and you know, so many things to think about, and so many pieces of history that are profound. And I just remember I grew up in Chicago, and I remember you know, there were some suburbs. I remember when I first became an attorney, I was looking at some documents in real estate. And of course, there was the no, you know, restrictive covenants, no Jews, no blacks. You can't, sell to them, right? You know, pretty interesting because, you know, seeing those things in writing and with legal effect, you know, and just imagining what that was like. And the other thing I would say is in fighting against, you know, the mentality of assimilation. For many years, I did a lot of immigration law. So from people from all these cultures and people from all over the world, and there's a push emotionally, psychologically to assimilate, to fit in, to conform. You know, but so that has to be dealt with at the same time. You know, when you talked about the mentality of, you know, Jews benefiting by the slave trade and the moral issues that brought up, you know, there's also that economic and emotional push to conform, especially for Jews coming from places of where there's persecution and so on. So it makes it even harder to kind of go where you want us to go, which obviously I think we're all on the same page.
Appreciate that. Thank you. And if I can just take from Thomas's comment and bring it to the moment, in a certain way, like a lot of those historical documents, like we'd like to think we would have done something differently, you know, because we're living in a different time than slavery, let's say. But our challenge is to figure out like what's our version of each of those documents in this moment. Which are they like? None of those people thought that what they were doing was so awful, or they wouldn't have like written it down, you know. And I think in the last year, like, you know, white America is just learning a lot of new stuff that I don't think we ever thought was all that awful. And now it's turning out that there's different perspectives on this stuff. So I guess that's the present challenge to all of us, is to reflect and to listen and to hear things in new ways. Schneer.
Yeah. Hi, Mark. I'm going to talk. I just wanted to mention the restrictive covenants in Palos Verdes. No people of color could buy a house here, and people of color included Jews. And this stayed on the books until the early 2000s. It wasn't enforced because of the laws then, but a Japanese woman went before the city council and asked to have it removed. And they were like, why is this important? We're not enforcing it anymore. Just leave it on the books. They finally got the idea and took it off the books, but not until 2000s.
Wow. As one raised in PV, I'm ashamed to hear that. And,
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Only the estates.
Yeah, this was PVE.
Yeah. Okay, that makes it even worse. That's why. You know.
Well, these have been some really wonderful questions and discussions. And I think that we can all take from your talk so many things that we can reflect on for our own time, as you were just saying as well, of the implications of this and the way that racism really has been a part of our American roots. So I thank you so much for bringing up these questions, for bringing in this history, for answering questions so generously. And it's always a pleasure to have you at TV, even virtually, maybe especially virtually, just because this brings a sense of nostalgia and warmth that I think we crave, especially now. So just thank you so much for being here with us. And thank you to everyone who joined this House lecture for being here today as well.
Thank you all. Stay healthy.
Thank you.
See you next year, if not before.
Thank you. A pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will certainly be more aware of my actions and my responsibility.